Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede. Later in the show, we will look at a move by the governor and some Republicans in the legislature to drastically weaken child labor laws in Florida so that corporations can tap into the cheap pool of workers following the state's crackdown on immigration. But first, speaking of the governor, the race to replace Ron DeSantis is beginning to heat up. On Friday, Republican Byron Donalds launched his campaign for governor. Casey DeSantis is also making moves to run. And despite Florida now being considered a red state, there are several Democrats who are hoping an anti-Trump sentiment might take hold by the time the 2026 election rolls around. One of those who could stir a lot of interest is David Jolly, the former Republican congressman from Tampa-St. Pete area. He has been an independent for a number of years, gaining a national following among liberals as a regular guest on MSNBC and Morning Joe. I spoke to him this week and asked him why he is thinking of running.
Well, in large part because our family's committed to this state. We have two young children, now 6 and 3 years old, and I think we're experiencing what all other Floridians are experiencing with an affordability crisis. I think a crisis in our public schools, a crisis with the voucher program. And I think a lot of people feel like maybe Florida's just been going too far in the wrong direction the last 6 years with culture wars and the other priorities of Republican politicians in Tallahassee. And so the decision we have made is to strongly considering running for governor and see if we can provide the change that I think a lot of Floridians are really hungry for.
What's your timetable? When will you make a decision?
I suspect we'll make a final decision by Memorial Day. You know, we wouldn't be speaking here today if we really hadn't come to the conclusion that we're ready to make the run. Obviously, there are some final dynamics that always influence making that launch. And so we're going through some of those final decision making.
You were a Republican member of Congress. You've been more recently with no party affiliation. You would have to obviously become a Democrat if you're going to run in the Democratic primary. Why do you believe the Democratic Party is your home?
Yeah, so I've long considered myself a part of the Democratic coalition. I have been an NPA and I enjoy the independent space. It's the largest growing voter bloc in the state of Florida and nationally as well. And I think it's because a lot of people reject having to conform to one ideology on everything. You sign up for a party and you kind of have to fit in a box. I think most voters own politics are kind of pluralist. They might be left, right, or center, depending on the issue. But I think what brings it all together is people just want solutions. They want a government that works for people and an economy that grows for all people. I do think in the dynamic, the environment of the last 8 years, really since we saw the emergence of President Trump and the new brand of republicanism, that the Democratic Party is really the vessel that can provide the best way to protect people's individual rights, stand up for the marginalized, provide for an economy for all people. And on these hard issues of culture wars that Republicans want to drag us into, I don't think Democrats need to follow them into those culture wars. I think after 6 years of fighting culture wars, the answer now is to fight for lower insurance rates, to fight for greater affordability, for better schools. And I think that's where a new Democratic coalition, yes, I bring a different perspective, having been an independent now for 6 or 7 years, but I think an emerging Democratic coalition in 26 can be the vehicle, the vessel that brings change to the state.
We've seen, though, this state go from being purple to being light red to being what many consider pretty deep red at this point, given the 22 election of Ron DeSantis and the 24 election of Donald Trump. What makes you think that there is a possibility for a Democrat to win statewide?
Yeah, look, that's a very real challenge, right? I do think if Democrats perhaps have contributed to their own shortcomings, it's that perhaps leading Democratic politicians, even in the state right now, have failed to meet voters where they are, right? There are a lot of issues in the state that matter to people. There are a lot of issues that Republicans and Democrats fight over. But to be honest, I'm not sure they're always fighting over big ideas on lowering property insurance, lowering property taxes, fighting for better schools, fighting to fix the voucher program. I'm not sure we've seen that, Jim, on either side of the aisle. And I guess that's part of my independent streak as well. I think Republican politicians have failed us. I'm not sure Democratic politicians have been able to fight back in the way that matters. Look, part of this is macro environment look like next August? Are we a nation and a state that is looking for change? I think a lot of people are concerned about the current direction nationally and in Tallahassee. If this is an environment next year where voters are looking for change, then the question for Democrats is, are you able to be that new party that meets voters where they are and provides the change they want? Because the change is not to fight more culture wars on the left to try to reflect the culture wars on the right. The change is actually to meet voters exactly where they're at. Our own family. Could we reduce our insurance rate by 60% if we had a state catastrophic fund to cover all natural disasters and so your private insurer doesn't have to cover those? What about the schools? You were promised vouchers that now are not keeping up with the rate of inflation in private schools. And the truth is, public schools are still providing better platforms of education, access to the trades, access to the arts. Those happen in public schools, but Republicans have failed to support our public schools. So bold ideas. Should we save the private insurance market or the property insurance market for homeowners? Should we say we want to build more schools in more neighborhoods with more teachers who are paid more? Should we fight the culture of corruption in Tallahassee and call it out when we see basically a campaign finance system that allows corporate bribes of our elected officials, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on? I think if we meet voters where they're at, what matters to them right now, we don't litigate the issues of 2024 or 2022, but we litigate the issues of now. I think we have a shot at closing that growing gap of Republican majority voters here in the state. It's been 30 years of Republican control. Look where that got you. If we don't provide an option to change that direction, it's going to be more of the same. Higher insurance rates, higher taxes, more failing schools. That's what we've got now. I think people want to change that.
You know, if I can quote the great Yogi Berra, it seems a little like deja vu all over again, in that in 22, the party turned to Charlie Crist, who had been a Republican, became an independent, and then ran as a Democrat. Are you essentially Charlie Crist 2.0?
I love that question because the answer is no, and here's why. With all due respect for Charlie Crist, you know, his message to voters was, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. That's not my story. I left the party. I think the Republican Party politicians, the elected politicians, have gone in the wrong direction. I also changed my mind. I test a different theory of the case in politics. Is it okay to change your mind in politics? For instance, you know, I still think we should have lower corporate taxes, but I think we should have more gun control. On the hard issue and the hard question of reproductive freedom, I grew up as a preacher's kid. I still participate in an evangelical church, and I wrongly conflated being pro-life personally with being anti-Roe in the political sphere. I've changed my mind on that. I think the Roe framework, the Roe v. Wade framework, is the proper way to secure reproductive freedom, but also allow churches to evangelize and celebrate their teachings of faith. I think my case is one in which I grew as I began to represent a very diverse community in Pinellas County, but as I think we have a very diverse state. So with respect to former Governor Crist, I'm not sure that's the case he made to voters when he suggested he would run as a Democrat. I think Democrats are right in their values, and I think they provide the right platform for change. Maybe I'm a little different Democrat, and I recognize that. But this is certainly not the case of Charlie Crist 4 years ago. This is David Jolly in 26 with a coalition that wants change.
It's interesting. We've got two special elections coming up in Florida on Tuesday. Congressional District 1, the seat vacated by Matt Gaetz, and Congressional District 6, the seat vacated by Mike Waltz. More than $17 million have been raised by Democrats between those two seats. How closely are you going to be looking at Tuesday's results in those two North Florida congressional districts to see if there is a moment building about Democrats being able to be re-energized?
All eyes are on those special elections in these congressional districts. And as you mentioned, a 30-point spread is very hard to close, even with all the money in the world. That's twice what the state spread is at 14 or 15 points right now. But do we see those numbers tighten? Do we see them come down about 10 points? Possibly so. And what we know in the giving that we're seeing nationally is particularly Democrats, but honestly, just members of what I call the Democratic coalition, a lot of independents, are trying to put their efforts into something. They don't like the direction we're currently going. They're concerned if it's buyer's remorse or not of what's coming out of Washington and certainly out of Tallahassee. Things seem to be getting worse, right? We saw the mishap with the national security team in the White House this week, the inability to keep classified information classified. People are wondering, is government really able to work for them? And this new Democratic energy, the new independent energy we're seeing, I think could translate into this entire 2026 cycle. Is this like a 1994 or a 2010 or a 2018 where you see a big swing? Look, for Florida to change direction in Tallahassee, it will have to be a big swing. Part of any Democrat stepping forward right now is to say, if the moment meets us halfway, if indeed the voters are hungry for change, I want to try to provide that change. I do think for national Democrats to rebrand or reposition the party, it would be smart to do it through state capitals like Tallahassee in 26. The national issues are so toxic and so hard to almost unwind for the major parties. But in states and municipalities, big city mayorships, county commissions, you have an opportunity for politicians of any party to really meet voters where they're at, to say, how do we work on your taxes, on your schools, on your roads? How do we work on getting money out of politics? How do we work on keeping schools and communities safer through smart gun laws? That's where voters are. And if there's an anxiety that threads together this coalition of people who want change, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, they just don't see government working for them. At its base, I think people want a government that works and an economy that grows, and that's it.
When we come back, Florida's move to weaken child labor laws. Stay with us. Welcome back. 10 days ago, Governor Ron DeSantis appeared on a panel with Donald Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, to discuss the crackdown on immigration. And part of the discussion was on the impact of businesses that no longer have access to cheap labor. And here's what the governor said.
What's wrong with expecting, like, our young people to be working part-time now? I mean, like, that's how it used to be when I was growing up. Why do we say we need to import foreigners, even import them illegally, when, teenagers used to work at these resorts?
And following that idea, the Florida legislature is considering Senate Bill 918, which would weaken child labor laws in the state. Here is the bill's sponsor, State Senator Jay Collins, last week, explaining the bill before the Senate Commerce and Tourism Committee.
Frankly, we're not talking the jungle by Upton Sinclair. We're talking about them working at Publix, at Piggly Wiggly, or jobs within the industry. This is a far cry. I think often we demonize the employer because it's going to take advantage of the children. This is a parental rights thing. Parents know their kids best.
Let's be clear. This is not about empowering parents. This is all about giving the power to businesses and corporations that hire children. Right now, 16 and 17-year-olds cannot work more than 8 hours on a school day. This bill does away with that. Right now, those children are not allowed to work before 6:30 a.m. or after 11 p.m. on school nights. This bill does away with that as well. Right now, if a child does work an 8-hour shift on a school day, the business is required to give that child a 30-minute meal break. Under Senate Bill 918, businesses no longer have to give those kids a break. Just keep them working. It also does away with many restrictions protecting 14 and 15-year-olds. More than 24 speakers oppose the bill, with one summing up her opposition this way.
If your justification for passing this bill is to allow minors to help provide even more for their family, then that's just deeply shameful. You're admitting that there's a cost of living crisis so bad that kids have to choose between their education or keeping their family afloat. And instead of taking big corporations to town or tackling the affordable living crisis, you're making kids work like it's the Gilded Age. It's shameful. Employers could constantly threaten to fire the minor if they don't comply with working long, late hours, or overnight. Stop using parental rights as a cheap excuse to allow corporations to exploit child labor.
And recalling DeSantis' recent comments about having young people working more, Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith argued DeSantis was simply saying the quiet part out loud.
The quiet part being that we're somehow going to solve the current labor shortage that we have in Florida that was worsened with anti-immigrant rhetoric with child labor.
The bill narrowly passed out of committee. One Republican, State Senator Joe Gruters, voted against the bill.
I can't vote for it. I voted against the minor bill last year as well. I think we need to let kids be kids.
After the hearing, I spoke to Senator Smith.
So it does look like Senate Bill 918 probably isn't going very far. The House Speaker, towards the end of the week, came out and said that he was troubled by the bill, by different aspects of it. I noted that even, not only did Joe Gruters vote against it, but even the Republicans on the committee that you were on seemed skeptical about the bill and were sort of saying that they were voting for it now to continue the process. But it does seem like it's going away. My question is, what does it say about us that this bill made it as far as it has so far and where we are right now?
Well, it's a really sad commentary on where we are right now, Jim, as a state, which is that we're suffering a labor shortage in Florida, one that has been aggravated and made worse by Florida's anti-immigrant laws that have affected the availability of labor in the state. And all you have to do to really fully understand the desperation of the issue is listen to what Governor Ron DeSantis said last week when he basically suggested that the way we can address some of these labor shortages is by employing teenagers. Now, we know already that teenagers are able to work. They're able to work part-time. There are good protections in place to protect minors from being exploited. But legislation like this, unfortunately, suggests that the state is willing to actually put minors to work and remove child labor protections in order to address the labor shortage that we have that has been made worse by anti-immigrant laws that have driven labor and qualified workers out of the state of Florida.
Nobody wants to see even foreign labor who may be here undocumented exploited either. So there's got to be a better answer. And I think one of the speakers that I listened to during the hearing talked about this is also a wage issue. I mean, if you're not offering competitive salaries, if you're not offering the hourly wage that's necessary to attract employees, then that's really at the heart of the issue, and it goes to the affordability crisis here in Florida.
Exactly right. And that's why, Jim, we even introduced legislation this year titled the Florida Economic Prosperity and Immigration Act, Senate Bill 1668, that does offer a better path forward specifically with those undocumented workers and workers with unregulated status that would be able to still be able to get an occupational license to go to work while still navigating our state's very complex, the country, the federal government's very complex immigration system. So the reality is that there are solutions out there, but instead what Republican lawmakers are doing is they are looking to do things like repeal child labor laws. There's even another bill that's moving through the legislative process right now, Jim, that attempts to offer workers sub-minimum wages, that basically violates our state's constitution, that guarantees a minimum wage that was approved by voters years ago when they supported the $15 minimum wage, and it would let employers just declare that a worker is an intern, which is not defined in the legislation, and that would enable them to offer sub-minimum wages. So, this is not the right path forward, what Republicans are doing here. And I know that there are other solutions that are out there that include raising wages and offering better benefits. And yes, even revisiting this issue of immigration in Florida.
I want to change gears here and talk about an issue that came up almost a year ago when Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed some $30 million or so in arts funding. It seems as if a lot of that may get restored, but with certain strings attached. And I'm curious as to where you see that going now. And one of the things I read is that in the bill right now, it says that funding would be only for programs where where the programming is appropriate for all ages. I guess give me your thoughts as to where we are with potentially restoring what is really a very, very tiny bit of the state's budget into arts funding.
Sure. Well, most folks who know me, I'm a senator from the Orlando area, but also former member of the Florida House of Representatives. I'm a longtime advocate of funding for the arts, not only because I love the arts, I love theater, I love music, I love museums, just like so many Floridians and tourists who visit our state do, but also because we know, based on the state's data that they have shared with us, that for every dollar in taxpayer money we invest in cultural and museum grants through that grant program in Florida, we receive $9 back in the state. It generates a tremendous amount of economic activity. It is something that both our residents and our tourists spend money on, and it's a $4 billion industry in the state of Florida. And yes, the arts industry in Florida was devastated when Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed $32 million or so in cultural and museum grants and grants from the arts industry that would have actually continued to create jobs and make our communities stronger. This year, I'm much more confident that the Florida legislature will be able to restore much of that funding and, in fact, put even more dollars in there to make sure that these grantees, which there are nearly 900 across the state of Florida who are eligible this year to receive those funds, will be made whole again after the governor issued that veto last year. And by the way, the governor has made even funding for the arts a partisan issue. When he brought in all of his new demands about making sure that arts grants are appropriate for all ages, he's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Under that standard, even entities and grantees like the Holocaust Museum in Central Florida, for example, would not meet the standard of being appropriate for all ages. And so it's best that we leave the criteria for qualification to the subject matter experts, as we currently do through the arts panel. And now it's up to lawmakers to step up and restore those funds.
I want to take a moment also to talk about another issue that the legislature may deal with. The House Speaker has talked about the idea of lowering the sales tax in the state of Florida, basically lowering it to, I think, from about 6% to 5.25%, so a sizable decrease. The sales tax, as you know, is regressive and often hurts poorer communities. Are you supportive of this? And how do you offset the money that would be saved by collecting from the state on the sales tax and not have that hurt other programs, like, for instance, the arts?
Sure. Well, it's certainly a bold proposal to reduce Florida's sales tax, which is the main revenue generator for the state of Florida. But as you just pointed out, sales tax are regressive. They basically put more of the tax burden in Florida on low-income people, and it makes it harder and harder for them to be able to have the opportunity to get ahead. So the devil is always in the details, Jim, but I am conditionally supportive of lowering the state sales tax as long as we offset that the right way and ensure that something like this is revenue neutral.
We'll be right back after the break. Well, that's all the time we have today. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to contact me at jdefede@cbs.com. I do enjoy hearing from you. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.